All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the war years. No, usually people know quite a bit, or at least something about World War II. But for historians, actually, World War One is a bit more interesting. And really, you can't talk about World War II without understanding World War One, how World War One came about, the armistice, bringing the war to an end. Okay, so let's just talk about what happened. First, let's talk about casualties. All right, the war was catastrophic, unlike anything anyone had seen before. It was the war to end all wars. 17 million people were killed, 20 million were injured. This includes both civilian and military people. Okay. The horrors of World War II often eclipse that of World War I, but this war was really bad. Let's think about the Battle of the Somme, all right, in France. More than 1 million soldiers died or were wounded in that battle alone, which raged for months. All right, historians will refer to 1916 as the year that Europe bled dry. Okay, America was really reluctant to join this European war. The U.S. was neutral until Germany violated our neutrality with unrestricted submarine warfare. So the United States entered into the war in 1917. Sometimes you'll hear this phrase, they rode into World War I on horseback and flew out in airplanes. This is not much of an exaggeration, believe it or not. In many ways, World War I was an old-style war fought with modern weapons. Why does this matter? Well, of course, there's the incredible loss of life. People started questioning ideas that we can truly make the world a better place. Like I was talking about last video about the social gospel, plus the ramifications of the war, especially the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war, but it really set up the world for another disaster. Okay, I want to point out that there was that no side actually surrendered in this war. It was an armistice, which basically means everyone kind of gave up because no one could do it anymore. However, Germany was basically blamed and forced to pay large war reparations, and this is really, really important. Okay, it's these large war reparations that end up kind of crippling the economy. In the 30s, you get this hyperinflation, and the situation is created where you can get somebody like Hitler rising to power. Okay, so the ramification of World War I on religion. First, this is pretty obvious, and your book points this out. World War I was primarily fought between various Christian groups, Christians killing other Christians, all right? Of course, it led to this decline in the social gospel. And in places like Germany, we start to see a warping of Christianity in the interwar years, really fed by increasing nationalism and scapegoating, all right? And I'm going to circle back to this. All right, here's a timeline of the interwar years. And by the interwar years, I mean the time between when World War I ends and before World War II starts. All right, so what's going on globally? Obviously, I have a number of items up on the screen. They are general events. However, religion responds to culture, and a lot of these big events do influence global religion and global theology. Okay, so 1920, some important things happen. In the U.S., women get the right to vote. Okay, prohibition also passes, which of course was a failure, but both of those big pieces of legislation happen. Also in 1920 in India, Gandhi launches this non-cooperation movement. All right, India finally gains independence in the 1940s, so it takes a while, but it's starting here. One thing that does happen as a result of World War I is that the casualties in Russia were so bad. It was the tipping point that sparked a revolution. The Bolsheviks came on top. And the Soviet Union was established. So like in 21, Lenin's new economic policy comes into place. 22, Mussolini becomes leader of Italy. 24, Lenin dies and Stalin takes over. Okay. In 1927, China is unified. In 1929, the stock market collapses. All right. In 30, Mao starts using guerrilla warfare tactics, and Haile Selassie assumes the throne in Ethiopia. 1933, Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. I want to spend a minute on this one. During the 1930s, you start to see a merging of Nazi ideology with Christianity. Obviously, this is problematic. I don't need to tell you why. But it's a really important cautionary tale about the accommodation of culture and religion and, of course, nationalism. Okay. Now, I do want to qualify the statement a little bit. In a sense, theology is always responding to culture, and it should be. But what we see in Germany in the 1930s is a rejection of basic elements of the Christian faith. An example of this is the German Christians like scrapping the entire Old Testament. Why would they do that? Because it's Jewish. Okay. What we get is a response to this, the Confessing Church. In 1934, the Barmen Declaration was written, and the Confessing Church was created. Karl Barth was one of the primary writers of this document. Barth, he is one of the most influential theologians, certainly in the 20th century, but he's up there kind of just period. He was a Swiss Reformed theologian. He was educated in liberal theology, highly educated, highly influenced by folks like Adolf von Harnack, Schleiermacher, and he became increasingly disillusioned by this, though, especially in light of World War I. Most specifically, he was horrified that many of his own teachers supported Germany's military exploits in the war. He wrote the Epistle to the Romans in 1919, so right as the war is coming to an end, which was groundbreaking. In this, he argues that you cannot attempt to ally God with human culture. Okay. So in the 1934, he's this primary writer on the Barmen Declaration, which rejects the influence of Nazism on German Christianity. He then mailed it to Hitler personally. Think about this for a second, all right? Just sends it to Hitler. All right. So Barth, like many other scholars who refused to swear an oath to Hitler, was forced out of his teaching position in Germany. He returned to Switzerland and to the University of Basel. So because he was Swiss and he was deported, he ended up avoiding the fate that many other confessing church Christians endured, which brings me, of course, here to Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was highly influenced by Barth. He was a Lutheran pastor. He was a theologian. If you haven't read anything by him, which I'd be surprised if you've managed to get through Luther Seminary without reading any Bonhoeffer, but if you somehow did, you should read something by him. He had a very promising career ahead of him when the Nazis came to power. He was always very, very against them, and he was vocal against them publicly and from the pulpit. Okay. After the resolution that applied the Aryan paragraph within the church, basically saying you have to be just like white Christians to be Christian, Bonhoeffer joined white non-Jewish Christians. Bonhoeffer joined other church leaders such as Barth, Niemöller in creating the Pastors Emergency League, from which the Barmen Declaration was born. Then he was involved in an underground seminary to train pastors in non-Nazi forms of Christianity. He was also involved in an assassination attempt against Hitler, interestingly enough. That is really, really why he was imprisoned in 1944. He was moved around a little bit, but ended up in the Flossenburg concentration camp. He died in 1945. The Allies were really, really close to liberating the camp, and he was executed on direct orders from Hitler. So let's talk a little bit more about World War II. Obviously, we've been skirting this, talking about Barth and Bonhoeffer, but World War II brought more devastation than really anyone thought was possible. Okay, casualties, about 60 million. All right, if you take into account disease, famine, which of course are always the companions of war, we're getting totals more like 80 million. Okay, the German final solution, about 11 million were killed in the German Holocaust. About 6 million of those were Jews, which made up about half the world's Jewish population. Okay, the war ends with the introduction of the nuclear bomb. Okay. Religion needs to respond. Think Karl Barth, and there are plenty of others. There's this fundamental shift in how we're seeing humanity, and this has significant effects in the academy. Okay, questions like, are we fundamentally good? Can we make that claim after what we've all just seen, what we've all just experienced? Okay, is progress in perfecting society possible? Okay, there's a lot more doubt about this. One theologian that I am particularly fond of is Reinhold Niebuhr, and I find him a really, really helpful figure in understanding this theological move. Niebuhr had actually been a social gospeler. In fact, he was a socialist. He even ran for office on the socialist ticket. Okay, he was a pacifist. He was kind of your quintessential socially conscious liberal pastor and theologian. Okay, until he wasn't. He became super disillusioned by liberal theology, kind of like Karl Barth had been. He was hired by Union Theological in New York in 1928. And interestingly, he didn't even have a doctorate, and he almost didn't make it onto the faculty because of that. He made it on by one vote. Interestingly, he was a professor there when Bonhoeffer was a student in the 1930s. He published a book called Moral Man, Immoral Society in 1932. And if you ever take my class on American theology, you do read it, where he essentially makes the claim that human beings are capable of choosing good. They won't always, but they can, where societies in general really can't. All right. And so that's really going to influence his theology. And so I think he's such an interesting figure because he's so just his life kind of moves from that liberal social gospeler to that disillusionment. So by the 50s, he's known for his Christian realism. Okay. So, such a societal and theological shift in those years. Okay. All right. I think I have talked enough about the war years. I'm going to wrap this up. This is my final video of this week. Next week, it's a little bit more uplifting. All right, we're going to talk about, civil rights, women's rights, and all those things and how that influences religion. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. Bye.